Welcome to the Kinvestor Report, where we conduct insightful interviews with industry experts to discuss the Canadian small cap markets. I'm your host, Arlen Hansen. Before we begin, I'm mentioning the standard disclaimer that no part of this interview is to be taken as investment advice, and I may own the securities of the stocks we mentioned in this interview today. If you find these interviews of value, be sure to join our network, subscribe to our page, comment in the videos below, and share them with like-minded investors. Today, I'm very much welcomed by Jesse Day, editor and author of The Commodity Culture. He writes a wonderful YouTube channel. He's been interviewing industry experts for the last few years, and he has absolutely tackled the industry. Super proud of Jesse, seen him come a long way. Jesse, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Arlen. Thank you so much for having me on. It's awesome to see you in a host role. You're a natural at this, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Well, no surprise today, but we're going to talk about uranium. I met you early on in your career, and then you found your love for uranium. So what made you fall in love with this sector? It's an extremely difficult sector to understand and follow, and it tends to beat people up a lot. So what made you fall in love with uranium?
Well, it started with a book called Energy, A Human History, which goes through the history of energy production over the course of humanity's history, and starting with, burning wood, coal, whale oil, very fascinating book. And it goes all the way up to nuclear energy. So that book kind of got me fascinated by the energy space in general and just how vital energy is to our survival on this planet. And so nuclear energy, and when it came to the investment space, I got captivated by uranium, probably starting with Twitter, because there's a crazy small community of Twitter uranium investors, and they're very passionate about what they do. And there's a lot of really smart guys on there who share a lot of information. So I kind of got sucked into that world. And when I started looking into it, it seemed very exciting. The thesis that's out there for investing in uranium, a lot of people are familiar with it, but in my mind, it's extraordinarily compelling. Just the fact that we're now kind of seeing a new nuclear renaissance all around the world. The amount of reactors being built out, being planned, being proposed is accelerating. We're seeing it being accepted as a form of green energy. We're seeing, the incentive price not really being there for uranium to be mined for the vast majority of developers and companies who are obviously exploring as well. So also the fact that you only really have two publicly traded producers, and that we definitely need more. So the whole setup for the space seems extremely bullish to me. I find it fascinating, and that's kind of what sucked me into the sector to begin with.
So do they call it the U-twit on Twitter? Is that what it is?
Yes.
So you've interviewed like an absolute boatload of industry experts of the uranium space. Who are some of the best interviews you can recall, and who kind of gave you some of the most insightful information?
Well, the first industry expert I ever interviewed was Justin Huhn, the uranium insider. He has encyclopedic knowledge of the space. He's definitely a guy to look to if you're new to the space and just want to get some information. I definitely recommend checking out. He has a YouTube channel as well where he talks about uranium, what's happening in the sector. He does interviews all the time. Another person I would mention is Mike Alkin. Mike Alkin rarely does interviews, so I was really honored to have him come on my show. Actually, it was Justin Huhn who introduced us because nice. I'd been trying to get a hold of him for quite some time. But he runs a fund called Sachem Cove Partners in New York, which invests exclusively in uranium. I said Justin's an encyclopedia of knowledge. I would say the same about Mike. When it comes to the numbers and the math, he is the guy to listen to. And I did an interview with him about a month back. It ended up going over an hour. The cool thing about that interview was I barely said a word. I basically just teed him up and let him go. And boy, did he go. And so I'd recommend people check that out too. If you really want to that's a bit more of an advanced interview. Maybe if you're already kind of dipped your toe in the water in the space, and want to get a little more technical and get to know the math behind the uranium fundamentals, then I would definitely recommend checking that out. But I would say those two, and Rick Rule, of course, Lobo Tigre, both of them are very knowledgeable in the space. Rick famously, his whole, the amount of money he made in the last bull run off of Paladin is obviously the stuff of myth and legend that people talk about throughout the industry. But that's also a little dangerous because a lot of people look at that, especially new investors, and think that they're going to be able to achieve those results, which is so highly unlikely. So I would urge some caution there. But Rick's a great source of information on the space, particularly when it comes to talking about individual companies as well, because he's now technically retired. He's able to dive more into the details about different equities. So in a lot of his interviews, he does do that. So it's great to get some insight there. He talks about the CEOs that run those companies very candidly as well. And Lobo Tigre, of course, the independent speculator, he's a great source of information on a variety of commodities. And he really knows his game when it comes to uranium as well. So probably those are the main experts that I've spoken to that have shed a lot of light on the sector for me.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more with you on those. So with everything you learned through all your interviews and all the research you've done, what are like the key factors right now that's kind of making uranium super attractive to you right now?
Yeah, so the first thing, as I mentioned at the top, is just the fact that the spot price is still well below the incentive price for most miners to bring uranium out of the ground. Now, the spot price is the one that's made public. It's the long-term contracting price that is very opaque because these contracts have NDAs attached to them. So you don't know what utilities are paying or what the agreements are. I can say that through speaking with Mike Alkin, he has mentioned that, and some prominent uranium company CEOs as well, they've told me that both the contracting terms and the floor prices, so that they're getting better terms and the floor prices are rising. And I think utilities are starting to realize it's kind of a precarious supply situation. One other thing I'd point to is new physical funds coming onto the scene. We obviously saw the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust be quite a game changer, causing the equities to run up quite a bit when it first came onto the scene and started sucking up pounds off of the spot market. The market's calmed down since then, which discouraged a lot of people, particularly those who got in after Spot came onto the scene. But we're now seeing additional physical funds. We're seeing Zuri Invest out of Switzerland, ANU Energy out of Kazakhstan. And again, keep referencing Alkin here, but he also brought up that he knows of a handful of other physical uranium funds that are currently getting ready to launch. I was also, I touched on the reactors as well. There's around 60 under construction currently, 100 on order or planned, and 300 proposed around the world at this point in time. And with Bangladesh, South Korea, UAE, Slovakia, France is building out more reactors, India, Turkey, the list goes on. And of course, the big giant in the nuclear space is China. They have a plan to build 150 nuclear reactors. That's a lot of nuclear fuel that's required. That's not to mention small modular reactors. I should also mention that the biggest nuclear power plant in the world is now being planned in Ontario, Canada.
Yeah, saw that.
Yeah, small modular reactors, which are starting to roll out and be proposed and planned. That offers an alternative to some places that maybe they don't want a full-on nuclear plant, or their grid can't handle a full-on nuclear plant. You now have another option. So that, some people have the misconception that small modular reactors are going to reduce the need for uranium because they're going to replace big plants, but that's not the case. They're an alternative. So they're actually going to increase the demand for uranium. And we're also seeing, the big story with Diablo Canyon and a few other plants around the world that were planned to be closed, but they've reversed course on that. That's more fuel that's going to be required. The restart, the big Rick Rule catalyst is the restart of the Japanese nuclear fleet.
Yeah.
And they're going full bore ahead with that. That's a lot of nuclear plants coming online. So I think, all of those things, obviously the world is going down this low carbon energy path. And nuclear energy is really the solution. If we really want to head in that direction, there's nothing better than nuclear energy. It's the cleanest, it's the safest energy form, a form of energy in the world. A lot of people don't realize that. Statistics change a little. It's at least on par with wind and solar in terms of deaths that have occurred due to energy generation, whether that be accidents or what have you, people falling off a wind turbine.
Sorry, I shouldn't
which
laugh at that, but it does happen.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
I should not be
It
laughing
does,
at this.
it does happen, but some charts or some sources of data will say that actually nuclear is lower than solar or wind when it comes to deaths that have occurred. So it's extraordinarily safe. People, it's a problem, because people just have Chernobyl in mind, which was its own very unique situation as to why that happened. Fukushima, which was obviously tragic, but there were issues with where the plant was built, knowing that Japan is prone to earthquakes and tsunamis. And nobody actually died in Fukushima, the Fukushima disaster, as a result of nuclear radiation. Sadly, a few elderly hospital patients ended up dying while being transported from hospitals that were close to the radiation zone, which is obviously unfortunate, but it was a very small handful of people. So it gets blown out of proportion, and people have a fear that these plants are going to fail. But the safety standards have come such a long way, and they're basically fail safe. Yeah, for the most part. So if you're okay with, wind and solar, you should be okay with nuclear, because statistically speaking, they're about even in terms of safety. So those would be the main drivers that I currently see operating in uranium's favor.
Yeah. Speaking of that, let's talk about how we're seeing this next generation of investors really start to becoming pro-nuclear and pro-clean. I'm seeing a big shift on the millennial crowd, the crowd much younger than me, because they also didn't live through the Chernobyls and the Fukushimas, et cetera, et cetera. How do you think that that's helping the uranium movement?
I think it's helping it a lot. We are seeing a particular type of investor that is environmentally conscious also entering the space. You have the people who just love commodities like myself and who like to look across the commodity spectrum, but you also have people who really believe in decarbonization and the new green economy, which I don't really. Maybe we can get to that later. Yeah. But that is definitely driving investment in the space. And I think people are finding the community. When I was talking about the Twitter community that kind of drew me in, I think that's also getting a lot of people into it. Now, there's obviously caution that needs to be applied there. Honestly speaking, the amount of investors I see on UTwit who are YOLOing money into these explorers without a discovery and these really speculative bets. And, there's nothing wrong with having a certain portion of your portfolio for speculative, it's all speculative pretty much in uranium, unless we're talking Cameco or Kazatomprom. But I mean, the real speculative stuff, when you start going into the exploration space, I think there's a place for that, but it seems that's kind of spoken of a lot on uranium Twitter. So I would urge anybody who's new to the space to definitely look into uranium Twitter. John Quakes is a really good guy to follow. He has a lot of just straight information. He's always has the latest news developments, and he posts a lot of information about the space. But be careful when you see people talking about particular stocks on uranium Twitter. When it comes to investing in the space for somebody who's new, I would recommend just go with an ETF. Obviously, nothing here is investment advice, but if
disclaimer again, here we go.
Yeah. I mean, if you can obviously go with the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust. That's just betting on the price of uranium going up. You can do HURA if you're in Canada, and URNM if you're in United States. They're very closely, basically the same. They hold Cameco and Kazatomprom is the most heavily weighted, and then Sprott Physical Uranium Trust. And then a basket of some of the developers, and then a little bit of the more speculative explorers as well. So yeah, that is where I think people should start out if they're new. And to your point, I definitely think the environmentally conscious movement is driving new investment into the space. And I think The big thing we're waiting for is institutional investment, right? That's kind of
Yeah,
something
of
that could
course.
be a really big catalyst. Yeah, more of that. And I think we will eventually start to see larger and larger institutional investment in uranium as the space picks up and as it becomes more and more apparent that nuclear energy is really the ultimate form of clean energy. So if you want to be ESG, in my opinion, it's the ultimate ESG play.
Yeah, well, I think when the generalists do come up, right, the bigger named uranium names just start to melt up because there's so few of them to be able to choose from, right? Like you said, there's two producing uranium companies publicly traded. So when that generalist capital comes in, they're going to be chasing two names, right? And then those are going to melt up, and then like the developers are going to melt up. The explorers will melt up, as assuming they've got good, high grade, exciting discoveries to talk about, right? Yeah, when it comes to like UTwit and Twitter, like I think that the platform is excellent to find ideas, but
Yes,
you
absolutely.
certainly have to take those ideas and do your own due diligence. And it does shock me again with what you said earlier, how many people just, will see something on Twitter. Oh, I'm jumping in, I'm buying the stock. Next thing you know, they're selling it for 40% lower because they don't know why they bought it. So yeah, I think these social media platforms are fantastic for finding ideas and new names, new news that's out there that doesn't necessarily hit your radar, but you really got to take that information and with a grain of salt with what you're reading and continue to do your due diligence after that to get to your conviction in the name. I was talking to Gwen the other day about uranium, and I've got a motto myself is I'm not buying a uranium exploration stock in the Athabasca Basin unless they have the discovery, right? Because the risk is just so high. And just because you've got a package of land in the basin doesn't mean that your stock is going to trade better or trade at better valuations just because you're there, just because you're an area play. And going back to when that generalist capital come in, it's going to be like, sucking something through out of a hose, or it's going to be an enormous amount of capital, entering into a space which has a very small market capitalization, and we're going to see some great gains, in my opinion. Talk to me about jurisdiction risks when it comes to uranium. Like we see production around the globe. Are there certain areas that you like better, or certain areas that you think are at risk, or where are you looking at putting your money?
I think it's very important to be geographically diversified. And, the Athabasca Basin is often called the Saudi Arabia of uranium. And a lot of people focus all of their capital there when investing in the uranium space. I don't think that's a good idea. In fact, I think a place like Niger in Africa is about equal risk to the Athabasca Basin, just in a different way. When we look at the Athabasca, the risk is environmental red tape, permitting, dealing with indigenous people in the area, which is, I'm not saying that's a bad thing and people shouldn't do it. Obviously, it's very important that all the stakeholders are respected, et cetera. But you just don't have that in a place like Niger. It can take decades to get a mine permitted in Canada, right? The rules are so unbelievably stringent. It's almost laughable sometimes the amount of time it can take. So I would just urge people to pay attention to that. Now, Niger, you obviously have potential political risk. You could have potential, as my friend Johnny Kovacevic likes to say, AK-47 risk. So you have to be aware of things like that. However, that being said, Niger has a 50 plus year history of uranium mining, with Orano having mined in the area for that long. And the government is extraordinarily supportive of uranium mining in the area. And just to compare and contrast, Global Atomic, which is my preferred company in Niger, they had an issue where they had an environmental group trying to put forth, I don't know if they were trying to just straight up sue them, or if there was some sort of, they were accusing them in court of breaching some environmental standards. And this is a court case that was resolved within weeks. Literally, the Niger government, because they're a partner of Global Atomic, fast-tracked the case and was like, no, let's get this resolved right away. And they got it in court and got it dismissed like so quick. That would have taken years in Canada.
Oh, 100%.
Years of litigation, lawyers, all this sort of stuff. So I'm not saying don't invest in the Athabasca Basin. I do. And obviously Cameco is there. And I think every investor in the uranium space should have access to Cameco, whether that's directly or through an ETF. But just be aware, I find United States to be very compelling because 18 to 20% of all electricity generation in the US is nuclear, and basically none of it is mined there in any, sizable quantity. And we've recently seen the US start a strategic nuclear fuel reserve where they got some uranium companies in the US to sell them uranium at a pretty decent price, actually. That was kind of a one-time transaction. We don't know if that's going to continue, but it is a sign at least that they're looking to support domestic production. So I also think it's important to have exposure to one or more companies in the United States. I don't really know too much about the Australian uranium market simply because it's not super easy to trade stocks on the ASX.
Yeah.
So I kind of stick to American and Canadian names and then also Niger, Africa. But I think it's important to have some degree of diversification just because there's different risks in different places and that can help you kind of mitigate some of it.
Yeah. And you never know when they're going to hit you, ever.
Yeah.
They're always a black swan event, it seems, right? So speaking of that, what are your thoughts on this Russian uranium sanctions?
So I'm against sanctions of all kinds. I'll speak about it first from like a philosophical standpoint and then from an investment standpoint.
Okay.
So I'm not really philosophical, just practical. Like it's kind of obvious that sanctions kind of hurt the sanctioning countries more often than not, at least equally to the country being sanctioned, if not sometimes more than. So I don't think it makes sense to levy sanctions. But getting that out of the way from an investment perspective, particularly when it comes to the United States, I think it could be a very big driver for uranium if things actually go through. The thing is, it's very difficult to sanction Russia because they're responsible for so much conversion and enrichment. You can't really, what are you then going to do? You'd have to build out domestic conversion and enrichment facilities. And the US is nowhere near doing anything like that. Neither is Canada, I don't believe. And most countries aren't. It's crazy how much of a stranglehold you could say that Russia has on that process of the nuclear fuel cycle. So a lot of if sanctions actually happen on Russian nuclear fuel, I think it could be a pretty big catalyst for the United States. The other issue is Russia, when we take conversion and enrichment out of the picture, Russia does not supply much of the world's uranium. It's not a small amount. Off the top of my head, I want to say 7% of the world's uranium, uranium comes from Russia. So it's not huge, but it's also not inconsequential. It might be closer to 14%. I don't have the figures in front of me, but that being said, I think sanctions could be a catalyst in the United States. That's where they've most gone through with potential sanctions. I believe there's at least one bill waiting to potentially pass to put sanctions on Russian uranium. So we'll have to see how that plays out. More than the actual sanctions, I think it just creates an awareness and a drive politically in the US to encourage domestic production. So whether they happen or not, the conversation's out there that the US needs domestic production. And so I think it can also help in that way, getting these companies producing greater quantities of uranium to possibly be purchased by the US government.
Probably create some speculation in the market about government funding and fast tracking assets as well. Right.
Yeah,
which
absolutely.
Everybody wants to see these assets being developed. All right. I'll just throw a hardball at you there, Jesse. Where do you see uranium in 5 years from now?
Uranium in 5 years from now, that's a tough one because I believe we are entering a uranium bull cycle if we have not already started one. You know, a lot of people's sentiments is very low right now in the uranium space.
For
I'm actually
sure.
seeing people throw in the towel or very close to it, or people saying, I just hope I break even. I guarantee you, if you look into those investors' portfolios, it's mostly junior miners, explorers. I bet you they don't have a large allocation to Cameco and to the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust, because they'd be doing just fine if that was the case. People gamble. They, like we were saying earlier, they listen to Rick Rule in an interview and he talks about companies he likes, and they just buy all those companies, or they get on FinTwit and get caught up in everything and start buying those companies. So I think we are entering a bull cycle for uranium. It may be a longer protracted bull cycle than the last one. Obviously, the last bull cycle had certain characteristics that made it hockey stick in such dramatic fashion. A lot of people point to the flooding of Cigar Lake, which definitely played a role. So I think we might see a slow grind up as opposed to a massive parabolic move. I could be wrong. Justin Huhn thinks we'll probably see a parabolic move. So it could go either way. But I think in 5 years, obviously, we're going to see a much higher uranium price. It does all depend, though, because you have other people like Warren Irwin who point out that, you know, if the price got high enough, perhaps Kazatomprom, which is the world's largest uranium producer in Kazakhstan, would ramp up production massively. So there's elements out there you need to look at. NextGen has an absolutely massive, super high grade uranium deposit, probably the best uranium deposit on planet Earth. And if they bring that into production and for whatever reason start producing a ton of uranium out of that mine, then we could see, you know, supply overtake demand. I don't think it's likely given the current setup. So I'm giving you kind of a non-answer, but
Yeah, well, fair enough.
I think the price of uranium will be much higher in 5 years. I'm putting the bet on that this is going to be a more protracted and longer bull cycle than the last one.
Well, I am putting you on record on this, Jesse. So you got to give me a price.
You're a price.
No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. But I will disagree with you that I think that in every bull market there becomes a mania period. We saw that last time. I want to say in 2005-ish. Forgive my memory, but yeah, uranium ran up to $120 a pound. And yeah. I see that this could also happen. I think the biggest move that we've seen in the uranium space in the last 2 years is the financial players looking at the supply demand fundamentals and saying this doesn't make sense anymore. And yeah. I'm not even sure if it's the true supply demand that's causing the spot price to move right now, rather than the ETFs that are coming in and taking uranium out of the market. So yeah. I think we're very, very early stages. And you said 300 planned nuclear reactors?
Yeah, 300 proposed, 100 on order or planned.
So,
yeah.
There's not enough uranium in the world to meet that demand, period. So we can all agree that uranium is going to be trading at multiples to where we're trading at today. It's just going to take some time. I wanted to button earlier on your comment about seeing some of your uranium bulls throw in the towel, and I'm not going to name names to save them the embarrassment, but there was 3 very specific, very bullish UTwit guys on Twitter that threw the towel in about 6 weeks ago. Yeah, sure enough, since then, all the uranium stocks have rallied. So maybe that was a little bit of the capitulation that took all the bulls out of the market for us to see these stocks trade higher from here.
Yeah, I love seeing people bemoan and on UTwit and say that they're out, or they can't believe things aren't coming together. What about all these fundamentals? It's crazy because some of these guys, and you know, I'm not being sexist here, the vast majority of them are guys. They end up, you know, getting in, like we said, throwing money at speculative explorers, not really doing due diligence on the space and deep diving into the thesis behind uranium itself and why they should invest in it. And then when they see their accounts in the red for a prolonged period of time, because they don't have that conviction, which is built with hours and hours of research, they just think they start to look to experts to help them. They literally start to tweet out, you know, tagging Justin Hune, what's happening? When is the price going to, why isn't the sector moving? It's like, okay, when you're doing that, you need to sell everything or decide you're going to, re-examine the space, take the time, look into the companies that you hold and why do you hold them. Rick Rule gives a really great piece of advice when he says you need to, for all the companies you hold, you need to look at what could go wrong as well as what could go right. It's really easy to look at why this XYZ developer is going to be producing X amount of pounds of uranium within a few years. But what could go wrong? And I think that's really sage advice that I think people should follow.
Yeah, no kidding. Talk to me about, well, I already know your answer on this because we've talked about it before, but the net zero initiative. I know you've got some strong opinions on this, so rattle away, and maybe I only get to ask you one question. You talk for an hour, so go.
Well, I think it's mostly a scam, and I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here, because obviously we all want a cleaner, greener planet. We want to clean up air pollution. But it's kind of the whole environmental movement has become more of a radical ideology. And there's no better poster child than this for Germany, probably. They are shutting down nuclear plants. Like, they're really extreme to where nuclear is no longer an option. And when you look at why they're shutting down nuclear, it's 100% because of radical ideology. Literally, the Green Party there has been anti-nuclear since the beginning. And so that's just a part of who they are. They will not change no matter what weight of evidence is presented to them. The net result of that is them having to burn more, not only thermal coal, lignite coal, the dirtiest form of coal that exists on planet Earth, they are now burning in massive amounts. So that's kind of a really good just kind of snapshot of the level of hypocrisy that exists there. The other problem is the ESG initiatives that are getting pushed on various countries. We look at the carbon tax in Canada. I think,
oh God, now don't get me started, please.
2 of them. Like, this is insane, because the carbon emitted in Canada, the population of Canada is equal to Tokyo. Just think about that. It's one of the biggest countries by landmass in the world, and it has the population of Tokyo approximately. Spread over that how much carbon can Canada really be emitting? And then you look at China ramping up coal output. You look at India ramping up coal output. Unless you can address those countries, it's worthless to do anything in Canada. Let everybody do whatever they want, emit as much carbon as they want. It's such a grain of sand, you know what I mean? When we look over the whole world. So those are some of the issues. Now, so solar, I don't think is completely useless. I think it has certain applications, perhaps, as an intermittent source of energy complemented by nuclear or natural gas. I just don't think you can do stupid stuff like cover hillsides in solar panels. It's a very poor energy return on investment. It doesn't make sense. I'll also point out that there's never been an energy transition from, a smaller energy, like a more dense form of energy to a less dense form of energy, which is now what's being attempted, right?
Oh, interesting.
So
yeah.
That doesn't make sense at all. And a lot of these solar projects and wind projects are fully funded by government subsidies. There's a lot of insiders making money off of this. In my opinion, it's a big grift. As I said, I think solar has some applications. I think wind energy is probably completely useless. When we look recently, Siemens got into the renewable energy space recently. Their stock plummeted around 37%. Because they had costly wind turbine failures. They weren't able to replace the parts. The amount of maintenance needed for wind turbines is absolutely insane. So if you're interested in energy, and particularly, ESG and the green energy, if you want to dive deeper into it and why it doesn't really work, I really recommend people search up John Polemy on YouTube. He talks about this a lot, and he does a lot of really deep research onto why these things don't work. Doomberg is another one that talks about this a lot. It's simple physics. It's just the energy return on investment you get for building out wind and solar is absolutely
garbage.
laughable.
Yeah,
it's complete and total nonsense. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not going to try. So, people talk about silver being involved in solar panel construction and that being a driver. It definitely can be, because they're going to build out a bunch of solar. China is building out a bunch of solar as well. So, as I referenced John Polemy earlier, he likes to say, heads we win, tails we win more in this situation. So I'm putting my money down on nuclear and fossil fuels. I'm heavily invested in both. I'm standing at the other side of Ursula, the head of the EU,
Yeah.
Olaf Scholz, Justin Trudeau, all these people, and I'm betting against it because I think that the green energy transition will probably be a catastrophic failure. If it's not catastrophic, it's going to be far, far less impactful than people think it will be. And the demand for fossil fuels is only growing as we're seeing developing nations, a new middle class emerging in developing nations like India, more people entering the middle class in China. That's going to increase and already is increasing fossil fuels a lot. I believe India has had record oil consumption recently, equal to before the pandemic. We're seeing, airline flights tick up and be in a lot of areas be back to pre-pandemic levels. So we're seeing a lot of demand come on for fossil fuels. They're not going away. All of these woke political, cabals that exist in EU countries and other legacy brand Western countries who want to eliminate fossil fuels. Well, the more they do that, the more other countries like India are just going to pick up the slack and use those fossil fuels. So, we also have OPEC, who obviously has large control over the oil price, and they're cutting production. We have the SPR, which is what many people point to as the reason why WTI crude has been going down recently and has remained where it is now around the $70 level. Meanwhile, China's building their SPRs, the US is draining it. So I just think there's a ton of bullish fundamentals behind the oil and gas space as well. And I think, I think people who invest in that space are going to benefit from the ignorance and the misguided policies and the hypocrisy of the green energy movement.
Well, we won't talk about politics for very long, but I will say whatever Justin Trudeau is putting on his platform, I'm against every single time. He's taxing the tax. It's absolutely ridiculous.
Although he is pro-nuclear, so we have to give Mr. Trudeau credit where credit's due.
He gets 3 claps, so that's about it.
Yes.
So with your comments there earlier, if you love uranium, do you have to love oil? Do you have to love natural gas?
I think that we should all be bowing down and worshiping oil and gas like a god. It is what has allowed our modern civilization to exist. Yeah. Everything that I can see in your area right now, everything around you is made possible by hydrocarbons. Same with this that's around me. It's crazy when you see protesters holding up signs made out of hydrocarbons with felt pens that were made by hydrocarbons written on them, wearing clothes made by hydrocarbons, wearing contact lenses made by hydrocarbons, taking medications made by hydrocarbons. The list goes on and on and on. I did a documentary about oil, which I recommend people check out on Commodity Culture, and it goes into just how many uses. It's the most used commodity. It's the most versatile commodity, and it has allowed the modern world we live in to exist. So you don't have to love it. I just said you should bow down and worship it just because it made your life possible. But as an investor, you don't have to love it, because oil and gas is I would argue a tougher space to approach than uranium. And the reason being is because uranium, as we discussed, is a very small space, in my opinion, as long as you don't get sidetracked into the explorers without discoveries, into, using all your money to buy into speculative stocks. It's got far less investable companies. So, you can literally just go Cameco, Kazatomprom, Sput, and you're kind of covered, right? But oil and gas just is such a massive, massive space. From an investment perspective, do you go with the big producers? Do you go with the mid cap? Do you go with oil field services? Do you go with pipeline companies? Do you go with, oil tankers, which I think is a very interesting space? And it goes on and on. So I think it's a little bit more difficult to wrap your head around, but I think it offers a very lucrative opportunity for people who are willing to look into it.
Cool. So back to uranium here. Let's rattle off some names that you really like right now.
I really like Global Atomic, as I mentioned before, in Niger. They are advancing from development to production within the next few years. Their economic assessments look very promising. That's another thing to mention. I only invest, generally speaking, in companies with at least a pre-feasibility study. So you can just get some estimates, keeping in mind that they can be completely off, but at least they give you some idea. So Global Atomic, definitely. I think that their relationship with the Niger government and how supportive the Niger government has been of uranium mining over the course of the last 50 years. I just think they're one of the best plays in Africa right now. Stephen Roman, the CEO, he lives and breathes uranium. And he's also the biggest shareholder of the company. So when we talk about insider ownership, he's got crazy skin in the game. He's got more than all like these big institutional investors. In the United States, I like Energy Fuels, and I also like UR Energy. Energy Fuels is also a play on rare earths, which I think is a very interesting space, particularly because China is now talking about cutting off certain mineral production. And China is one of the main hubs of rare earth production on the planet, as well as processing. And they're already holding back certain minerals. I forget which ones it was. It might be molybdenum. I might be wrong on that. Someone in the comments below can maybe correct me. But if China has started along this road of stopping exports for certain minerals, if they turn to rare earths, that's going to be disastrous, because rare earths are not rare, as the name implies, but they are very difficult to find in mineable deposits. And Energy Fuels has access to a lot of rare earths. They've produced rare earth carbonate. They've proven that they can do it. And they've also produced a lot of uranium in the past. In fact, in the not so distant past, they were the second largest uranium producer in the United States, besides Cameco. So definitely they have a history of production. They have the only licensed uranium mill in all the United States.
That's in Utah, right? The White Mesa.
That's right. That's right. And they have a ton of properties in Wyoming. UR Energy also in Wyoming. And I should mention Wyoming as a jurisdiction. It's extraordinarily mining friendly. It might be the most mining friendly jurisdiction in the United States. The government's fully in support. I was speaking with John Cash, the CEO of UR Energy, and he was saying he can literally drive to the local governments, the officials that he needs to speak to when it comes to his operations, and literally just get a meeting right away and sit down and chat with them. So I think that's a huge advantage. When it comes to the Athabasca Basin, obviously I like Cameco. I like NextGen because they have one of the greatest uranium deposits ever discovered. There's some question. There's some question as to when they will actually get to production. I've heard some people say as soon as 2024, 2025. I don't think that's realistic. I think it might take longer, but I think it's worth owning simply because of the quality of the deposit. I think Denison Mines, they're looking to do ISR in the Athabasca Basin. They've done preliminary tests with their ISR, which have been very promising. And it's really tough cutting through environmental red tape in the basin, in Canada in general, as I said. And they got their test greenlit, which they actually did some ISR, a very small amount, and the results were very good. So I have full confidence that they will eventually get permitted. Again, they're going through the environmental regulation process. So those are the main companies. And of course, Cameco and Kazatomprom, I think, should be owned by every uranium investor. Kazatomprom's difficult to own directly because it just trades on the London Stock Exchange, but you can get access to it through ETFs like HURA and URNM.
Yeah. And so what are the ETFs that you prefer in North America?
Both of those, HURA and URNM. So HURA trades on the TSX and URNM trades on the New York Stock Exchange. Yeah.
Cool. Jesse, thank you so much for your time today, buddy. Great to see you. Great to see you killing it in this industry. Please check out his commodity culture channel on YouTube. We'll put the link at the bottom here. He does have some excellent documentaries on different metals: silver, uranium, oil. I know are three off the top of my head, but I'm sure you have more. Once again, if you enjoyed this interview, please turn to join our network, subscribe to our channel, comment on our videos below, and share them with like-minded investors. Jesse Day, host of The Commodity Culture. Thank you so much for your time. Until next week, folks.